Hi, I'm a fat little Asian man, and this is Indonesia. Just look at this place. 270 million people with over 700 ethnic groups, all spread out across 17,000 islands. Now, here's why Indonesia fascinates me. My journey with racism has shown me one thing. Diversity usually equals competitive ranked racism. Whether it's friendly jokes like the Philippines, sibling banter in Southeast Asia, or just straight up insanity like the Balkans, all signs to show Indonesian racism being top class. However, Indonesian racism is not what you expect. Normally when you attack Indonesia, you're going to be met with the most elite level of racism you've ever seen. It's what a certain Estonian had to find out the hard way. But now, most criticisms of Indonesia are instead replied with agreement and gratitude. The proud Indonesia-mentioned Raws that once flooded the comment sections are now quiet. Even the classic banter between their brothers, Malaysia and Singapore, is no longer the same. The friendly arguments of whether nasi lemak is really from or rants on passport rankings are still happening, but it's not the same. It's all because the online debate in Indonesia has shifted. Instead of each other's differences, people are all increasingly discussing about the state of the country itself, the protests, the corruption, and the government. While naturally it's easy to think that corruption taking over the racism debate is very recent, what I've learned is different. Throughout history, what it means to be Indonesian has always been about letting go of differences and fighting against corruption. It has always been an integral part of Indonesian racism. Curious as to what I'm blabbering about? Well, join me on this journey to see how Indonesian racism is just insanely corrupt. One thing, I'm not Indonesian. I just made this video after watching Jay is Awkward and Moses. So Indonesians, please correct me for anything wrong in the comments. Thank you. Before we look at Indonesia's history era by era, we have to briefly go over how elite Indonesian racism is, just to understand how impossible it should be for them to unite against anything at all. Having the fourth largest population with 700 ethnic groups on thousands of islands means Indonesia itself is its own racism ecosystem. The fact that anybody can so easily become and targeted as a minority basically makes this place a free-for-all, survival of the fittest racism server with no mute button. From how I can understand, at the center you've got the self-proclaimed Sigma Jakartans who think they're the only city in the entire country. But you can't really blame them when you look at how bizarre the Jabodetabek region is. You've got Bekasi, where the amount of people with the immense sea heat and smog makes it seem like you're on a different planet. On the opposite, there's Bogor, which seems to have typhoons every day. Also with Depok, a place where residents were convinced that a small pig was a literal demon. Meanwhile, both Tangerangs are competing for supremacy. The other regions are just as, if not more, strange. There's Sumatra to the west, where you can be Indonesian Walter White in Aceh or see Indonesian Gotham City. In the middle, you've got Jungle Ohio, where the Dayak people have their own Jujutsu Kaisen spin-off. And in the east, you've got Papuans playing Far Cry in reality. But it's this relationship of mutual bewilderment and confusion that makes everyone hate but also love each other. And it's like that on every single region. Whether you're Garutans obsessed that the Austrian painter died in their backyard, or riding Komodo dragons in Nusa Tenggara, it applies to everyone. But the fact that this chaos is growing more united against corruption just shows how impressive the current situation is. You can only get this level of unity in Indonesia by calling Bali a country or mistaking the flag for Poland. But it always wasn't this way. Like any history on racism, Indonesian racism begins with colonialism. But what makes the Dutch colonial period so interesting are the Dutch colonialists themselves. It was back 400 years ago when Indonesia was called the Dutch East Indies. These guys were not like other colonialists. They weren't interested in silly stuff like ideologies or spreading culture. The Dutch had zero interest in assimilating the population, spreading their language, or really building an empire, except at the very end. The Dutch were solely interested in one thing: money. The problem was, when these shipwriters arrived to the region, it was a bunch of independent sultanates, kingdoms, and tribes. To the Dutch, all those unique different nations meant something unbearable to them: less profits. Which is why they just stitched them all together one by one into the Dutch East Indies, because it's just easier to extract from them as one singular unit. All they really cared about was extracting resources as fast and efficiently as possible. Everything they did here, like wide-scale forced labor, slavery, exploiting pre-existing divides, and brutal suppression, were done for the one same purpose: even the social hierarchy. Like how the Dutch turned all those kingdoms into one colony, they also categorized everybody, ethnicities, religions, professions, all of them, into one social class. Now, by forcing all 700 ethnic groups to work as Amazon warehouse employees, the Dutch ended up giving people shared experiences. A Javanese farmer and a Bugis sailor had almost nothing in common, but now both were classified as inlanders, both working for the same boss, and both had no human rights. Honestly, kind of amazing that their national identity starts from these exact shared experiences that would end up helping them work together to fight a brutal war and achieve independence from the Dutch. But now that the final boss was defeated, there was a new problem. All 700 ethnic groups kinda just wanted to go back to their own thing. I mean, Indonesia didn't exist as one nation before colonization, and now with the Dutch gone, most of them remembered they kind of hated each other and didn't know why they had to be together in this strange new Indonesia. Enter Sukarno. He's the first president and also the leader in the struggles against the Dutch. During the war, he noticed that without unity, Indonesia had no chance against the Dutch or any other colonizers. To him, being separated meant that Indonesia was vulnerable to being colonized again. So Sukarno made sure to stress unity, like a lot. He made the state ideology, Pancasila. It stresses national unity and democracy, but also doesn't state a specific state religion or ethnicity. Also, he made Bahasa Indonesia the national language, deliberately not the majority Javanese, but one everyone had to learn. He also set the national motto, Unity in Diversity. Even though it sounds like your company's HR training quote, it meant everyone could all fit being Indonesian without compromising their own home ethnicity. Now on paper, that all sounds real nice, but not so much in practice. Unity was all from Sukarno, meaning it was top down, not from any genuine mixing or understanding between groups. Ethnic communities largely stayed in their own islands. The shared identity was more of a political agreement. Also, there were three main factions that ran Indonesia: the military, Islamic factions, and the Indonesian Communist Party. They all had different ideas on how the country should be ran. The balance was kept by Sukarno's sheer riz alone. And yeah, it was a disaster. One's riz could only last so long when balancing the largest non-Soviet communist party in the world and the anti-communist military at the same time. Plus, Sukarno's paranoia with anything related to the West, with economic mismanagement from an already Dutch PTSD and war-torn Indonesia, made the chaotic post-independence period even more of a catastrophe. Like you'd expect, it didn't take long before the communists and the military started to kill each other. After a botched coup and a series of assassinations, a military general named Suharto would end up kicking out Sukarno and becoming Indonesia's second president. Now, unlike the more eccentric and idealistic Sukarno, Suharto was your classic military dictator. Military caps, medals, and of course, wide-scale corruption. Suharto was an expert at hijacking national unity for his own gain. He had become president in the first place by framing anybody against him as a communist, then purging somewhere between 50,000 and 1 million people. Very much in character, his first action in office was to exploit unity to shut people up. Yes, literally. He enacted the SARA policies, meaning ethnicity, religion, race, and intergroup relations. SARA is a bunch of policies that basically meant any and all discussion about each other's differences in any way was banned, all in the guise for Indonesia's unity. Want to laugh at your Sulawesi bro about their small gene pool? You've just committed treason. Want to compliment your Papuan friend's looks? National security threat. Such national unity policies were the way Suharto enforced his regime while silencing others. Suharto was Javanese and made sure that his inner circle and government was centered around Java. His migration policies also meant that millions of Javanese families were pushed onto other islands, ignoring customs and land rights. But you couldn't say anything about it because of SARA, and on the off chance you did, you would end up like East Timor. With this method of enforcing control, Suharto's regime became one of the most corrupt regimes at the time. Unlike Sukarno, who ended up dying relatively poor under house arrest, Suharto was estimated to be the fourth richest man in the entire world. It makes sense, as during his 32-year regime, it is estimated that his family network embezzled around $73 billion. It's because the entire Indonesian economy was run on a corrupt patronage system with his family right in the center. Not only did his children get the rights to natural resources and the country's largest industries, all companies were forced to pay a 10% business tax to Suharto's family. Even though the economy did grow a lot under Suharto, all the corruption meant that the growth was widely unequal and unstable. which is probably why when the 1998 Asian financial crisis hit, Indonesia was struck the hardest. Even countries like Thailand and South Korea, who were devastated by the financial crisis, Indonesia was hit nearly twice as hard. The rupiah lost 80% of its value in days. Unemployment exploded. Millions fell into poverty overnight, and inflation was at a record 81%. Not only did corruption make the financial crisis hit harder, it was stretched out for much longer too. Unlike Thailand and Korea, which received bailouts from the IMF to save their economies, Suharto refused to change his patronage economy in order to receive the $43 billion bailout. He basically chose to save his family monopolies and corruption instead of the entire Indonesian people. And of course, the people's dissatisfaction was at a new peak. It finally looked like he was going to take responsibility for his actions. It's just that Suharto had the same old trick up his sleeve from 1966, scapegoating ethnic divides. The target were Chinese Indonesians. Anti-Chinese sentiment has always existed since the colonial times when the Dutch installed Chinese settlers as middlemen. But the Suharto regime had perfected the image of Chinese Indonesians as greedy, untrustworthy foreigners by using Sara to the fullest. And now they were ready to pin the blame of the financial crisis to them. State media all collectively began reporting on how Chinese Indonesians were manipulating currency and engineering the crisis for a profit. It was a lie, but it redirected all that 32-year pent-up anger towards a visible minority. And just like that, anti-Chinese riots erupted in major cities, leading to the tragic deaths of over 1,000. Chinese neighborhoods were burned and businesses were looted. All that chaos was perfect for Suharto's military to once again justify control and crack down on dissent just like they had done so 30 years ago. But while the military could manipulate desperate starving locals into a race war, most people were not fooled. Distancing themselves from riots, people took to the streets protesting for Suharto to be prosecuted. The Reformasi protests that ensued were absolute cinema, as across Indonesia, the colorful alma mater jackets of student protesters contrasted with the cold grey military that tried to block them. Kinda poetic that the country which achieved independence by uniting over their differences had once again come together chanting the same Reformasi instead of making it about race. It's how the people ended up forcing Suharto to step down. While they did succeed, it was a bittersweet moment. Not only were Chinese Indonesians scapegoated, the anti-Chinese riots gave Suharto and his top officials enough of a distraction to basically get away with their corruption and crimes. Suharto himself never saw the inside of a courtroom and later passed away on bed rest. It's why his family is still one of the most powerful and richest dynasties in Indonesia even today. Dismantling the system of corruption that Suharto maintained for decades was not going to be easy. Especially as without Suharto, there was no longer a centralized force preventing regions from declaring independence. Plus, decades of Suharto's Sara and migration policies were exploding out. Aceh had been fighting a separatist insurgency for decades. Papua had never stopped resisting. East Timor had already left. Ethnic and religious conflict was breaking out all over the country. The question of, is Indonesia going to be the next Yugoslavia, was very real. The solution the Reformasi governments chose was pemekaran. Instead of military officers in Jakarta telling you what to do with a gun pointed at your face, pemekaran was about letting regions have control over their own affairs. It was a nationwide process attempting to de-Suharto. 11 new provinces and dozens of new districts were created at every level. Regions that used to be governed by military officials who knew jack all about them now had their own local governors. Compared to Suharto or Sukarno, the Reformasi era isn't really as head-turning or dramatic, but honestly the racism implication was real. Under Suharto, your local language, your customs, and your complaints were all Sara violations. But now, local governments could show off and teach their local history and customs, and people could finally mingle with each other without it being a national security threat. At the start, it looked pretty promising. People had an actual reason to stay in a country instead of just blowing it all up. With real attempts to change, it did seem like Indonesia's future was finally going to be bright. But don't worry, Indonesia always finds a way to disappoint both the optimists and the pessimists. Everything starts out with big ideals, but it always seems to find a way to be corrupt somewhere in the middle. Pemekaran itself was another good concept that got hijacked by local elites, creating similar nepotism and corruption on local levels. And that disappointment was here to stay, even for Indonesia's new fresh start, Jokowi. For a country full of military leaders and political dynasties, Jokowi was just a successful furniture salesman, promising change. And bro actually delivered. Schools, hospitals, and roads were all built. He visited remote Papua and Kalimantan that previous presidents had skipped. Health insurance coverages were expanded, more transparency in government activities and budget. Everything looked really great. It's just that it wasn't. Now, even if you have a new leader, it's still the same parliament, the same parties, and the same patronage networks from the 1960s. Most of all, it also means working with them. Slowly and pragmatically, Jokowi began making peace with it all. And just like that, in his second term, he passed the KPK law. Now, the KPK, or the Corruption Eradication Commission, was one of the biggest wins of the 1998 Reformasi protests. For 20 years, it stood as the country's most trusted anti-corruption institution, and Jokowi had basically made it into a tool to manage political opponents. Large student protests erupted out of Indonesia, and yet they could not stop it. Don't worry, it gets worse. Jokowi and his brother-in-law changed the constitution so that Jokowi's 36-year-old son, Gibran, could now qualify to run for vice president. Sounds like political dynasty behavior, right? Well, it's more complicated than that. Gibran ran alongside this guy, Prabowo Subianto. Now, not only was he a former general accused of massive human rights violations during Suharto's regime, he's also Suharto's former son-in-law. Yeah, the Suharto connections speak for themselves. You're telling me it's not suspicious when his ex-wife / Suharto's daughter openly came to support his campaign? So why would Jokowi, the literal poster boy of Reformasi generation, join his son with Prabowo, a residue of Suharto's military elite? Well, it was the end of the road for his pragmatic compromise. Indonesian presidents can't run after 2 terms, so by handing over his son, Jokowi made sure his son would carry on his legacy. With Gibran by his side and a social media rebranding, Prabowo successfully distracted Gen Z and millennials who have no living memory of Suharto's times. Instead of mass killings, kidnapping activists, and race war general, they just thought he was some cute dancing grandpa helping out Gibran's career. And when they realized who they had voted in office, it was kinda too late. Literally the first thing Prabowo did in office was take his 100-member cabinet and conduct a full-scale military boot camp with them. Yeah, it seemed he was done cosplaying as the Gemoy grandpa and made it clear what he wanted. Not only does his cabinet consist of the most military officials since Suharto, he also made it legal for active military personnel to take up more civilian government positions. Did I forget to mention he also raised the defense budget by 37%? Oh, and of course corruption. The KPK was effectively useless, with even its chairman being suspected in a massive corruption scandal. In a time of post-COVID chaos and widespread layoffs, forcing millions of people to juggle several gigs at once, Parliament tried to secretly pass a monthly allowance worth 10 times the minimum salary. Naturally, people weren't very happy, and it didn't help that the Nepo babies were showing off LV bags on TikTok. Their dissatisfaction started off small as mostly student or worker protests, and predictably, Prabowo wasn't too keen on them. Not only did the media start censoring out protests, the police started off with riot gear blazing. But they went too far. On August 28, 2025, a food delivery driver was struck and crushed by a police armored vehicle during a protest. At just 21 years old, he had gone out to earn enough for a bag of rice. He died, and the country broke. It was the beginning of Indonesia Gelap, or the One Piece protests, spreading across all provinces. The demands were simple: reverse the parliament allowance, investigate Jokowi's family, reverse the KPK amendments, end the military's return to civilian governance. Not about ethnicity and not about religion. The centuries of uniting over corruption had paid off. Every generation of Indonesians had had to figure out what being Indonesian actually means, despite different people in charge trying to separate them. The Dutch made them inlanders, Suharto made them silent, Reformasi made them citizens, and now Prabowo is in the process of teaching them something new. Plus, Indonesians are also extremely online, which made them actually interact even more. Independent digital journalism built audiences over the past decade by doing exactly what the Suharto era banned: covering ethnic tensions, reporting political corruption, and not shying away from real problems. It's why when Prabowo tried to use his old scapegoating tactics once more, it didn't work. Indonesians were no longer easily manipulated into redirecting their anger towards minorities. The fact that a country of 700 ethnic groups is protesting together rather than fragmenting is not accidental. It is the accumulated result of every era's choices. Of course, Indonesia is hardly a racism-free paradise. Regional stereotypes are still strong, the skin color hierarchy exists, and scapegoating is still a strategy. But the point I want to move across is, Indonesians have learned to let it all go for a bigger cause. The question is whether this generation's answer sticks. Because every previous generation that united against corruption won the battle and lost the war. Suharto fell, his family kept the money. The KPK was built, then dismantled. Reformasi happened, then got corrupted. And it seems Prabowo will try to centralize Indonesia even more. He has declared Suharto a national hero despite all the backlash and criticisms. Even during the currency crisis, he called regions village people, and is continuing in expanding the military. We'll just have to see how and if Indonesians will get to end this era of corruption and stay united. If you've enjoyed this video, please subscribe. I make these videos by myself and I don't use AI, which you can probably tell from how my video looks and sounds different from AI channels. So it would be a big help if you subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. Here's some other content that you may like.